This is a Mr. Men book, my book about me, by Mr. Silly. Mr. Silly wanted to make a book. Now, what can I write about? He said to himself. He took a sip from his mug of hot toast. I know, I can write about me, he suddenly declared. So Mr. Silly got a pad of paper and began. He dipped a carrot in a pot of ink and began to write, messily. It is not easy to write with a carrot, but Mr. Silly did not use a pen. That would be far too sensible. He wrote down the title, My Book About Me. And then he wrote about the time he went to the Nonsense Land bookshop and bought a book. 1 page. At a time. It took a very long time to buy it. But then Mr. Silly changed his mind. Just writing about himself might be a bit boring. I would disagree, but Mr. Silly had made his mind up. Or was that down? You never can tell with Mr. Silly. He decided he would include his friends in his book. If his friends were in his book, then they would want to read it. First of all, he wrote about Mr. Wrong. Mr. Wrong reads his books upside down, whereas Mr. Topsy-Turvy reads his books back to front. So he would begin with the ending and end with the beginning. How topsy-turvy. Mr. Silly wrote about Mr. Greedy and his many cookery books. And Little Miss Magic and her amazing book of spells. Then there was a chapter on Mr. Busy, a very short chapter. Mr. Busy was too busy to ever finish a book. Finally, Mr. Silly wrote about Mr. Happy. Well, it is always nice to finish with a happy ending. Mr. Silly was very pleased with his story. He decided to invite round all his friends who were going to be in his book for the big reveal. But first, he had to make it. He went out to his shed and took down a saw and a hammer and a box of nails, which was odd. It took him all night long to make the book. Mr. Silly's book was big as a house, with a door. Mr. Silly opened the door and invited everyone in. "Welcome to my book," he said. "I have something to announce," he continued. "You will be very pleased to hear that you will all be famous because you are now all in my book." How very silly.